quick before we get into that, hey, like 31 days ago, the Astros were 10 games back in the division. And as of yesterday, they're at the top of the division. Like 1 month, 10 games. Now, that's pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy. That has nothing to do with what we're looking at today. I just thought that was important, and we should all make sure we know and acknowledge that. So Mark chapter 5, this does have to do with the message. So I'm the type of person that has a really, really hard time trusting new people or trusting new things. Like if you haven't proven like a long track record of trust with me, I'm going to have a hard time like diving in and really putting a lot of faith and confidence in you. Back for the 4th couple weeks ago, we went and visited some family, and so we were staying with my brother and sister-in-law, and my brother-in-law had just gotten a new Tesla. And he's like, hey, do you want to go drive the Tesla? I'm like, sure. Now, I know we live in Houston, like we need oil to be doing well and all that, but man, like if you haven't driven an electric car, like it's fun, man. They fly. So I'm like, yeah, I'll drive it. So we take it out, we're driving. He's like, hey, I got the self-driving feature on this one. So like, push this little button twice and check it out. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, yeah, just tap this twice and then just like take your foot off the gas, take your hands off the steering wheel, and it's going to drive itself. Now, we're not on like a straightaway road. We're on this little road, like one lane going this way, one lane going that way. They live in a small town outside of Asheville, North Carolina, in the mountains. Like this little road we're on, like curving all around. You can't see in front of me. Like, dude, I don't know about this. Like, this is crazy. Like, no, just do it. You're going to be fine. So I do it. I take my hands off the wheel. It starts turning. Like, there's cars coming the other way. I mean, I was just so freaked out the entire time. Got Azariah, my son, in the back. I'm like, I can't do this. Like, I got to take over. Like, I just do not trust this. I have such a hard time, like, putting my confidence in something like that. But again, even more like people who I put my trust in and then they kind of fail to, follow through on that trust. When that happens, man, it's kind of like, this isn't good. This is like a character fault in me. But if I trust you and you let me down, it's like, man, like, I'm never going to trust you again. I have a hard time going back and re-trusting someone who has let me down. Now, for those of us who are followers of Jesus, what do we do with God? When we go to God in trust, when we come to God in faith, we pray to God in faith, we ask God for things and we believe He's going to do those things, and then God doesn't do what we asked Him to do. God doesn't come through with that thing that we had the faith that He was going to come through with. What do we do in those situations? Do we give up and say, see, God, I knew you weren't trustworthy, or do we keep trusting and do we keep having faith? That's what the story we're going to be looking at in Mark chapter 5 is all about. So we're going to pick it up in verse 21. This is what it says. It says, Jesus got into the boat again, and he went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. My little daughter is dying, he said. Please come and lay your hands on her, heal her, so she can live. So Jesus went with them, and all the people followed, crowding around him. So here's the scene. Jesus and the disciples, they return to this village called Capernaum. This is where a lot of the story of Mark's gospel has taken place so far. And so in Capernaum, that was kind of Jesus' home base. He had done miracles. He had started to get a little bit famous people. The word has spread about all the things Jesus has done. So as soon as they get back to Capernaum, there's these crowds that come and start gathering around Jesus. They want to hear what Jesus has to say. They want to see if Jesus is going to do more miracles. So this crowd gathers around Jesus, and in the middle of that crowd, this man named Jairus bursts through. He comes, he falls at Jesus' feet, and he begs Jesus. He says, Jesus, my daughter is dying. Please come and heal her. Now, here's who Jairus was. It tells us in verse 22 that he was the leader of the local synagogue. So what that means in Jesus' day, Jairus he kind of would have been like a medium-sized fish in a large pond. That's kind of who he was. Jairus, this leader of the local synagogue, he most likely wasn't a member of the Pharisees. They were kind of this ruling party of the religious leaders. He wasn't part of them. He wasn't part of the ruling elders over the synagogue in Capernaum. Instead, he would have been just kind of a common person, a lay person who would have been appointed by those ruling elders to oversee the day-to-day operations of the synagogue in Capernaum. And by the way, this synagogue that Jairus has been appointed to kind of oversee, this is the same synagogue that earlier in Mark, Jesus cast a demon out of a guy in, and it's the same synagogue that on another occasion, Jesus heals a man who had a disabled hand. So Jairus is the leader of that synagogue. So again, here's kind of who he is. He's a guy who's important. He has some social standing. He has some social power, but his standing and his power is power that has been given to him by those who really hold the social standing and the power. Okay, so he's got some influence. He's got some leadership. He has some standing, but it's all been appointed to him by people who really hold the power in their hands. And that's important to realize because what Mark's gospel has already told us up to now is that those people who really have the power, those people who are really in charge of the religious system in Jairus' area, those people who really have the social standing, we've already been told that those people do not like Jesus. Right, we've been told that the people who are essentially Jairus' bosses, the people who have put Jairus into power, we already know, Mark has already told us, that they don't believe Jesus, they believe Jesus is a blasphemer, and they are already trying to have him killed. So in Mark chapter 3, verse 6, we looked at the story back a month or so ago, but Jesus goes into the synagogue, it's the Sabbath, he heals this man who has the disabled hand, and technically, according to their religious rules, that was a violation of the Sabbath. And so what it says in verse 6, it says, "At once the Pharisees went away and met with the supporters of Herod to plot how to kill Jesus." So those people who are plotting to kill Jesus, those are Jairus' bosses. All right, so he's a man, again, he's been put into a position that affords him some power. It affords him some social standing. It probably affords him a decent income. His position gives him and his family a pretty good, a pretty decent life. But here's the tension. The people who have put him into that position, the people who are affording him that good life, are already enemies of Jesus. And so up until now, Jairus has kind of, he's remained kind of on the fence when it comes to Jesus. He hasn't taken a stand one way or the other as to who he believes Jesus to be. He believes, we see in the story, he believes that Jesus has done miracles. He has witnessed the miracles with his own eyes. He was probably there at the synagogue the day that Jesus cast the demon out of the man. He was probably there at the synagogue the day Jesus healed the man with the disabled hand. So he knows that Jesus does miracles. He believes that. But he has certainly not taken this public stand to follow Jesus yet, most likely because he knows his bosses who can fire him hate Jesus and want to have Jesus killed. But here on this day, the worst case scenario of every parent happens. His daughter is dying. Mark tells us at the end of the story that she's 12 years old. So this man's baby girl is dying. So in desperation, with nowhere else to turn, he comes to Jesus because, again, he's seen Jesus heal people. So he falls at Jesus' feet and he begs and he pleads. He said, "Jesus, I've seen you heal other people. Jesus, will you please come and heal my daughter? She's dying. We have nowhere else to turn to. We have nowhere to go." Jairus puts all of his eggs in the basket of Jesus. Because again, think about this. Jairus is risking his job. He's risking his livelihood. He's risking his social standing. He's putting that all on the line. Because if his bosses who want Jesus killed, if they see him coming and bowing at the feet of Jesus, they are not going to be happy. It's going to be over for him. But he puts all that on the line because he actually believes that Jesus can heal his daughter. And this is all or nothing, right? If Jesus heals his daughter and she lives, but they end up seeing it and firing him and he loses his job, who cares? Like, that's a net win. Any dad will take that in a heartbeat, right? Do anything to save your kid's life. It'll be worth it. But if Jesus can't heal his daughter and they see him bowing at the feet of Jesus, he loses his daughter and he loses his livelihood. He loses everything. So understand with who Jairus is, and this is incredible faith and trust that he is putting in Jesus. He comes and he begs Jesus, "Jesus, my daughter is dying. Will you please come heal her?" So Jesus compassionately says yes, and they take off to go to the home where she's staying. So again, verse 24. It says, Jesus went with them, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them, but she had gotten worse, not better. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe, for she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. And immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized that once that healing power had gone out from him, so he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my robe? But his disciples said to him, look at the crowd pressing around you. How can you ask who touched you? But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. So this huge crowd is following Jesus. I mean, it's basically a moving mob trying to come along and get a glimpse of this miracle that they think Jesus may be about to do. And in that crowd, there's this woman who it tells us she has been bleeding. She's had some sort of internal hemorrhage for 12 years. For 12 years, she's done everything she could do. She's gone to every doctor and specialist she could find. It tells us she's basically spent all her money, and no one has been able to help her. So she's at the end of her rope. She hears Jesus is in town, and she hears that Jesus is maybe this miracle worker, and she thinks maybe if I can just get to him, then I can have healing. And an interesting detail here in that Mark tells us is he tells us that this woman has been bleeding for 12 years. And as we get to the end of the story, he's going to tell us that the little girl who is dying is 12 years old. And so what that means is that 12 years before this day in Capernaum, two families had two very different experiences. 12 years ago in this town, one family was celebrating as they brought their baby girl into the world. And another family was grieving as a father's baby girl was diagnosed with this medical condition that she would carry for the next 12 years. But on this day, they both encounter Jesus. And so this woman, she believes, hey, if I can just get to Jesus, if I can just touch the edge of his robe, then that will be enough and I will be healed. I mean, like, that is incredible faith. She believes that Jesus is so powerful, just by touching his robe, she can be healed. And so she bursts through the crowd, she gets to Jesus, she touches his robe, and it says there, immediately she could feel that she was healed. And so as this happens, Jesus knows something's up. He stops the crowd. He stops this kind of moving caravan, and he looks around, and he says, who touched me? And the disciples, they're like, hey, Jesus, like, that's kind of a ridiculous question. There's hundreds of people who are touching you at every moment. Like, we're this huge moving mob right now. What do you mean, who touched you? But Jesus knows what he means, and the woman knows what he meant. So she comes and she falls at his feet, now healed, and Jesus speaks to her compassionately and affirms her and says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. Now, as all this exchange is happening, like, remember how the story started. There's this guy named Jairus whose daughter is dying. So as this exchange with this woman is happening, put yourself in the shoes of Jairus for a moment. Remember, you have risked everything. You have risked your career, your livelihood, coming to Jesus because your daughter is dying, and you believe that Jesus can actually do something about that. But on the way to your dying daughter, Jesus stops, and he takes precious time to interact with this woman who's had the same medical problem for 12 years. Okay, now, this woman's medical problem, was it a big deal? Yeah, it's a big deal. Was it urgent? Absolutely not. She's made it 12 years. She can make it another 15 minutes, right? If I'm Jairus, I'm like, Jesus, like, good for you. Like, yeah, let's come back. Let's help out this lady. But Jesus, like, she's been dealing with it for over a decade. She can wait a few minutes. Like, my daughter is dying now. Please forget her for a few minutes. Let's go to my daughter, and then you can come back to her. That's how I'd feel if I'm Jairus. Right? This is like if your loved one has a heart attack. You call the ambulance. They come. They put them on the stretcher, take them, put on the siren. They take off. You're sitting there in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. And then they get a call on the radio like, hey, this person over at this house has a headache. And then you hear the ambulance driver say, hey, we got some Tylenol. Yeah, we'll stop on our way into the hospital and drop off something. What are you going to do? Like, you're going to go all John Q, like Denzel Washington from that movie, right? You're going to pull out a gun and say, you are not stopping this ambulance for anything. Get to that hospital now. Right? That's basically what Jesus is doing here. There is an urgent life or death need. And he stops and takes precious moments to interact with this woman who she's got a problem. She needs help. But it is not at all urgent. So I can imagine how Jairus feels the desperation in his soul when seconds count, his daughter is dying. And Jesus stops and he pauses and he seemingly wastes time interacting with this woman. So verse 35 says, while he was still speaking to her, this is Jesus, while Jesus is still speaking to that woman, Jesus is still taking precious time talking to this woman, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling the teacher now. So again, man, just put yourself in Jairus' shoes. I can't even imagine the emotions that he's going through right now. Like, obviously, the grief and the shock of losing his daughter, but that combined with what I assume had to be anger and resentment toward Jesus, because he'd put all of his faith, he put all of his trust in Jesus. He believed Jesus could do something. And then Jesus stops for something that was not urgent when Jairus had such an urgent need. The grief and the shock and the anger and resentment toward Jesus in that moment, I can't imagine how he felt. So here's the question for us today. If you're a follower of Jesus, how do you tend to respond when you trust Jesus? When you believe in him, when you put your faith in him, and he doesn't respond on your timeline? Right, when Jesus is seemingly slow to act regarding the things that are on your heart. When you pray and you trust and you believe and you don't see the answer to those prayers that you asked for, how do you respond in those moments? Because that's what Jairus is experiencing. That's exactly what he is experiencing in this moment. He has risked it all. He has put all of his faith in Jesus, believing Jesus would do what he's asking him to do. And Jesus doesn't do what he asked him to do. What do we do in those moments? So I believe those moments are an invitation from Jesus, and it's the same invitation he gives to Jairus, because look at how Jesus speaks to Jairus. It says, Jesus overheard them. He overhears the messengers telling Jairus that his daughter has died. Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, don't be afraid, just have faith. Which, man, like, in that moment seems like just such an insensitive, horrible thing to say. Right? Like, as a pastor, if I go to the hospital, if somebody who's just lost your loved one, I say, hey, don't be afraid, just have faith. They should slap me, rightfully so, right? Like, what are you saying, Jesus? Like, have you not, like, gotten training on grief counseling? Like, what is going on? It seems so insensitive. But Jesus says to Jairus, here's his invitation. He says, Jairus, don't be afraid, just have faith. His daughter is dead. And not like Princess Bride, mostly dead, right? Like, she is dead. She is dead. And in the middle of that shock and grief, Jesus says, don't be afraid, just have faith. And I believe that's the same invitation for us. Right? When we have faith initially, and we trust, and we believe, and we pray, and we don't see the answers that we are hoping for, the question for us is, will we still have faith? When God doesn't initially do what we want him to do, will we still have faith? Jesus here, he invites Jairus into a deeper faith. He says, Jairus, have faith. And the reason he does is because Jesus is doing something. Jesus was not late. He wasn't delayed. He didn't get sidetracked and distracted. He had a plan the entire time. He's up to something here. So verse 37, he says, don't be afraid, just have faith. And then it says, then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, that's of Jairus, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. He went inside and asked, why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead, she's only asleep. Which again, so insensitive because no, she is actually dead. It says the crowd laughed at him, but he made them all leave, and he took the girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying. Holding her hand, he said to her, Talitha kum, which means little girl, get up. Now, real quick note here. If you see it there on the screen, that Talitha kum, that is an Arab, or not Arabic, it's an Aramaic word, which is, Aramaic is the language that Jesus spoke. That was the language, the spoken language of this day. Mark's gospel is written in Greek. It's written in a different language. So everything else that Mark writes is written in Greek, but when he writes his gospel, that word, he actually writes it in Aramaic. He records the exact words that Jesus spoke, and here's why he does that. It's because he wants us to know that what Jesus said, there wasn't some incantation, there wasn't some magic healing formula of this day. It was just this common phrase that was said by fathers every day in Israel because the power wasn't in the words that were spoken, the power was in the person who spoke the words. So he records it in the Aramaic. Amen, you can clap for that. He records it in Aramaic because this phrase, little girl, get up, this is what every dad in Israel would say when they go wake up their daughter in the morning. There's no power in those words. There's power in the person who speaks the words. So it says, holding her hand, he said to her, Talitha kum, which means little girl, get up. And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around, and they were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened, and then he told them to give her something to eat. So Jesus does here what no one would have thought was expected and no one would have thought was possible, even Jairus. Right? When Jairus first comes to Jesus, he believes that Jesus could heal his daughter. And the reason he believes that is because he has seen Jesus heal people. He's got a framework. He's got a mental picture of Jesus healing people. But Jesus bringing people back to life, there was no framework of that. No one had seen that. That had not happened. There was no concept of Jesus being able to do that. And so here's what happens with Jairus. Jairus asks to see Jesus' healing power. That's his ask. That's what he comes to Jesus for healing power. But what does Jairus actually experience? Not Jesus' healing power. Jairus experiences Jesus' resurrection power. Right? Jairus comes and he wants to see healing, but instead he sees firsthand the glory and the power of God being fully manifested in Jesus, the Son of God. That's what he actually gets to experience. He gets so much more than he asked for in the first place. But here's what I want us to see. Here's why Jairus was able to experience that. It's because in this moment, when he had lost all hope, when the thing he asked for did not come to fruition, and he was in grief, and he's probably a little angry at Jesus, he responded to Jesus' invitation when Jesus says, don't be afraid, just have faith. See, in that moment for Jairus, when the messengers come and they say, your daughter is dead, he had a choice. Do I keep trusting Jesus, even though he didn't do what I asked him to do? Or do I walk away from Jesus, literally? Right, because remember, they're on the way to Jairus' house. They're not yet at the house. So to have faith in Jesus would mean Jairus would have to keep walking side by side for we don't know how long until they got to the house where his dead daughter was lying. He had to make a choice. Do I tell Jesus, you didn't do what I asked you to do, so there's nothing else left, just thanks for nothing? Or do I keep walking with Jesus? That's the choice that Jairus had. And in that moment, even though he would have had no way to understand what Jesus was about to do, he said, I'm going to keep walking with Jesus. He responded to Jesus' invitation of don't be afraid, just have faith. And as a result, he got not just the healing he asked for, but resurrection that he could never have imagined. See, this story for us, it's an invitation for us to trust Jesus, to trust in his power, to trust in his goodness, to trust in his love for us, even when we don't get the things that we ask for. Even when things don't work out like we want them to be. Even when we don't get the things that we believe we so desperately need. Those times where God's timing is not our timing, where we don't see the answer to the prayers that we're praying. This is an invitation for us to keep walking with Jesus, to keep having faith, to keep trusting in his goodness, even if we have no idea how that's going to play out in our lives. And real quick as we close, here's why. Here we see in the story a few reasons why we can trust Jesus in those moments. First, man, you can trust Jesus even when things aren't going how you want them to go. You can trust him because he cares for all of us. The thing about the compare and contrast of the two kind of main characters in this story, you got Jairus and then you've got the woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. Think about how different they are. Jairus is named, which means the people in this region, they knew who he was. He was somebody. The woman, Mark doesn't even record her name. He doesn't even know her name. She is unknown. All right, Jairus has social power. He has influence. The woman has no social power or influence. Right? Jairus here, he is the leader of this synagogue. This woman, because of her condition, she would have been considered ceremonially unclean, which means that she hasn't been allowed to even attend synagogue for 12 years. You have the leader of the synagogue and somebody who hasn't been to synagogue in 12 years. These people could not be more different, and yet Jesus cared for both of them. Like whoever you are, whatever your social standing is, whatever power you do or do not have, Jesus cares for you, and you can trust him. Another reason we've seen this story we can trust Jesus is because Jesus cares about all of our needs, from the biggest to the smallest. Right, so think about Jairus' need in this moment. His daughter is dying. Like, there is not a bigger need than that. That's as big as it can get. And Jesus cares for that need. He shows up for that need. And then the woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, I think it's like, this is kind of like a medium-sized need, right? Jesus cares for that need. But I love how the story shows us that Jesus cares for even the smallest, seemingly insignificant need. This girl who has died, and Jesus brings her back to life. Look at how it ends in verse 43. Jesus gave them orders not to tell everyone what had happened, and then he told them, give her something to eat. Jesus just performed a resurrection, and he's concerned that this little girl may be hungry. Like that she needs a snack. Jesus is like, hey, dying kind of took it out of her. Could somebody go like get her a BLT or something? Could somebody make her a turkey sandwich? Like she's probably a little bit hungry here. Right? In this story, we see Jesus giving attention, giving care to the biggest needs. The fact that a girl's dying. It's kind of medium-sized needs. Somebody has this ongoing medical condition. And the smallest, most seemingly insignificant by comparison need. This little girl is hungry and hasn't had an afternoon snack yet. All right, listen, what that shows us is that whatever is on your heart, however big or small, however insignificant it may feel to others, God cares for that. And God invites you to bring that to him in trust. Here's another reason for us to trust in Jesus even when we don't get what we're asking for and believing for. It's because his timing is not our timing always, but he is always doing something. Right, for Jairus there, when Jesus stops and he seemingly wastes time and he's speaking to this one, that was certainly not Jairus' timing. And in that moment, when the messengers come and say, your daughter is dead, it didn't feel like Jesus was doing something. But then by the end, he could see what Jesus was doing. Now for us, We may not ever see on this side of eternity what Jesus is doing in every circumstance and situation, but we can trust him that even when his timing feels off, he's always there and he's always doing something. And Psalm 46 says that God is our refuge and our strength, that he is our ever-present help in times of trouble. He is our ever-present help. What that means is that he is always present. In those situations where his timing feels off and it feels like he's absent, what his word says is no. Even if it feels like he's absent, he is there. He is ever present. And we can trust that he is doing something even when we can't see it. But here's the main reason. Here's the biggest reason for us to respond to this invitation of Jesus, to have faith, to not be afraid, even when we trust and we believe and we have faith and we pray and things don't go how we want them to go. The main reason we can trust is because Jesus is at work bringing us into eternal glory and joy. See, here's how the Gospel of Mark is going to go. Eventually, by the end, Jesus is going to go and he is going to be killed. He's going to be executed and murdered on a Roman cross. But he wasn't a victim. He allows it to happen. And the reason is because on that cross, what he was doing was he was dying as a substitute. He was dying as a sacrifice to pay for the sins of all mankind so that we could be forgiven and be brought back into relationship with God. So Jesus would go to this cross. He would give his life. They would take his dead body down. They would bury him in a tomb where he would lay dead for a couple of days. And on the third day, after his death, his dead heart would begin to beat again. He would get up and he would walk out of that grave, defeating sin and death and hell forever, so that anyone and everyone who puts their faith in him will also rise from death and live with God forever in his new creation, experiencing peace and pleasure and joy forever with God. That's what Jesus has accomplished, and that's what he is bringing us into. That's really what the invitation to put our faith in Jesus is an invitation into. It's an invitation into eternal glory and joy. And because of that, we can trust in Jesus. Listen, in this life, in this broken, fallen world, we're not always going to understand what he's doing. We're not always going to understand his timing. We may not always get the response and the exact answers that we hope and we believe and we pray for. That's just a reality of our world. We may not always get the answers we hope and pray for. But we are guaranteed that Jesus is bringing us into eternal glory and joy with him forever. And listen, here's the reality. The reality is that the pain and the suffering and when the timing seems off, the things we don't understand in this world, all of those things, listen, hear me, all of those things are not even going to be like a drop of water in comparison to the ocean of joy that we will be swimming in with God forever. They will not even compare. And because of that, Jesus promises us that. He promises through faith in him to bring us into that eternal glory and joy. So we can trust him no matter what. Let's pray.